I know you've got big dreams for your writing, but your readers have needs too, and I want to help you to know how to meet them.
You mean it, bud?
Well, yeah, that's kind of all we've been doing here for the last several years.
So you can help me with my story?
Well, I didn't know you were writing anything.
Well, it's sort of like a novella with a postmodern twist, but also inspired by the old Hermetic texts and my own experiences. Really, it's about the indomitable nature of genius and the complexities of justice.
Right, but I just mean like what's it about? What's the story?
I don't understand. It's about the indomitable nature of genius and the complexities of justice. The story is just a vehicle for that.
Yeah, but your readers will be expecting a story, right? Like, not just a treatise on genius and justice.
You're not making it any clearer. It's a story about the indomitable nature of justice and
Yeah, I know. I think you said. I mean, who are the characters? What's the setting? What kind of conflict drives the plot? What's the story about?
I'm going to be real honest here, bud. You've totally lost me. I'm sure I'll figure something out as I go, but none of that's really the point. The point is to tell a story about
the indomitable nature of genius. I know. Well, since we've got guests waiting for a show, why don't you just sit back and listen to what I've got to say? I think you might like this one.
Well, there's a first time for everything, I guess.
Actually, our gilded patron's problem is probably one of the most common issues I see in the writing that comes across my desk. It can show up in slightly different ways for new writers in the first year of college and with more experienced writers that I work with as clients, but the basic issue is the same. The writer, as a normal human would, writes a piece that does what the writer wants it to do. Maybe something like, I don't know, declare some truth about the indomitable nature of genius. But for all that piece does to meet the writer's needs, it ends up leaving readers in the dust, lost, overwhelmed, and maybe even afraid. It's the story that has grand philosophical purpose but no plot, the poem that meditates on the nature of mortality without any imagery, or the essay that vibrates with all the sadness of a life unfulfilled without any orienting context. Whatever it is, the writer is going about their glorious mission, and the reader really just wants to know what's going on. And when I say it happens all the time, I mean I have a mental category of short fiction that I refer to as void stories, because they all start the same way. Character A, who may or may not have a name, enters a state of consciousness in unfamiliar surroundings, which we'll call unfamiliar void epsilon. They're always alone, it's always dark, and sometimes, for variety, it's also damp. Character A usually seems to have some or most of the usual human parts, like hands and legs. But anyway, Character A isn't sure why they're in unfamiliar void epsilon, so they start moving from their spawn point to another location, usually feeling their way there because, don't forget, it's dark. In happier stories, they'll wander for a while before meeting the magical Void Guide. In sadder stories, they'll encounter the terrifying Void Monster. And in more realistic stories, they'll stumble upon the unforeseeable Void Secret that suddenly makes us realize that unfamiliar Void Epsilon is even more unfamiliar and void-like than we thought before. And I'm being a little over the top, but only a little. If you don't spend much of your time reading a bunch of other people's writing, you might be surprised just how common stories like this are. And because they're so common, you should A, not feel like I'm singling you out if you're one of the dozens of people who have written a void story that I've happened to read, and B, not feel bad if you're realizing just now that you've written a void story in your life before. It's so common, I'd frankly be more surprised if you hadn't.
Well, hang on, I live in a void. What are you trying to say?
Oh no, there's nothing wrong with living in voids. The trouble with void stories is that when I'm reading one, I also feel like I'm in a void. As a reader, there's nothing to hold on to, no solid ground to plant my feet on. The main character isn't sure where they are, but I'm not even sure who they are. A spy, a hostage, a produce clerk abducted mistakenly by aliens, a centaur? I don't know. But there's certainly a consciousness of some sort in a place of some other sort, and they're doing something for reasons. Do I get to know them? No, I do not. But the character, though lost in the void, seems a little less lost than I am, so I wonder why the author isn't telling me as much as they know. Now, I understand not wanting to tell me that the Archduke of Unfamiliar Void Epsilon is actually the main character's long-lost father, but surely it would be okay to tell me that the main character is an accomplished cellist and that she's awakened in the village jail for playing a protest sonata. At least then I'd know what was going on and wouldn't feel like I was hurtling untethered through interstellar space. And like I said, it's not just stories. I've read a lot of poems where my best possible response is to say, it's clearly a very happy poem, but I don't really know what it's happy about. And I've also read a lot of essays where I feel just totally out of the loop, but I can tell that something important happened to the writer as they wrote it. And I think the easy and counterproductive move would be to dismiss your readers as incompetent and illiterate. Literacy is dead, and if people were smarter, they'd be able to understand tacitly what's going on in your poem, because you did, after all, title it A Popsicle, which is, of course, an anagram for Episcopal, which means that when your poem says, "I cling unknowingly to the unimaginable thoughts in my mind, grasping at the unfelt feelings and ineffable whys of these unrelenting oppressions," you are actually expressing your dismay at being scolded for the first time by your kindly neighbor who was also Episcopalian, and how that totally reframed your childhood understanding of adults, and how even the nice ones could sometimes yell at you. And after that, you approach the whole world with more caution. And that's wonderful and all. But if I have to somehow intuit that understanding your poem depends on me unscrambling a popsicle in order to link it back to the Episcopalian neighbor I didn't know you had as a child, then, well, guess what? You just wrote a void poem. And it's not my fault that I have no idea what your poem was about. It's unreasonable for you to think that I could know a fact about your childhood that isn't anywhere but still in your brain. Now, again, I said this was common, and it is. It happens all the time. But as common as it is, I've also had a hard time explaining what it's like to be the reader of a void story or a void poem. And that difficulty lies in the simple fact that writing something is such a different experience from reading something. Just as a small example, it takes a lot longer to write a page than to read a page. When I'm writing, I think to myself, it's probably been long enough since I've used the word nevertheless, so let's throw one in. Then, when I go back and read it, I think, why am I saying nevertheless every 32 seconds? But of course, it goes much further than that too. When I'm writing, I have access to all of my thoughts, memories, and experiences. I know what I'm trying to say. I know the assumptions that I'm trying to make, and I know the definitions I have in mind for certain words. When I say in my essay that I went on a date and saw insect comedy, you might think I saw one of those animated comedy movies about insects. Maybe I went to a comedy show and all the jokes were about insects. Well, guess what? You're wrong, you illiterate hack. I went to an art museum and there was a painting there called Insect Comedy. What? You say you would have guessed it was a painting if I had told you it was an art museum? I think that sounds like a you problem. In other words, the common issue is not that writers can't stop writing void stories. The common issue is that writers are naturally and constantly several steps ahead of their readers. Writers have the advantage of all the process and the living and the planning and daydreaming behind the work that readers will just never have. Sometimes writers just have a hard time seeing their work from an outside perspective, so they don't do a very good job of making their tacit understanding of the work explicit. Other times, they get so excited about their grand design that they want to rush to the praise of scholars and forget that they need to tell a story first. Either way, the writer has failed to fulfill a reader's basic needs. And it's hard to tell somebody who's trying to make a philosophical statement about the indomitable nature of genius that I don't understand or care about that genius because I just don't have a clue what's going on in the story. To someone trying to work in the rarefied air of deep thoughts and literary genius, it's just going to sound like I missed the point. Surely the great artist has just created something that's beyond my simple understanding.
Is this sarcasm directed at me? It feels like this sarcasm is directed at me.
No, I could never.
More like you could never get to the point. Quit complaining and let's hear this solution.
All right, take it easy. The other day, I was pondering the problem of the void story and the challenges of responding to them, and my mind wandered to a little chart that always seems to show up at every teacher training I've ever been to. You know it, you love it, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, I'm no psychologist, but the basic idea is that people have different kinds of needs, and some are more essential or fundamental than others. So, for example, a person is going to have a hard time caring about the quality of their relationship with their sister-in-law when they're trapped in a submarine and running out of air. A physiological need like breathing often needs to be taken care of first in order for a person to make progress on a higher order need like having a good relationship with their sister-in-law. Or in an educational context, for example, people often say that students will have a hard time learning and achieving their academic potential if they're hungry or just got evicted or feel alienated from their classmates. Self-actualization sounds great, But I just don't have the capacity to deal with that when I'm worried about where my next meal is coming from. And because teachers often see students only for a few hours a week and don't have ready access to the rest of their students' lives, they will naturally and understandably get frustrated with students who don't perform in class, not realizing that the students are dealing with a more fundamental need outside of class and that they aren't just lazy good-for-nothings. So, if a teacher discovers one of those fundamental needs, they can connect a student to support resources like an on-campus food pantry or the housing office, that will help the student to succeed in school much more effectively than a lecture on adult responsibility and academic integrity ever would. Meet the basic need first, and there will be a strong foundation to build on from there. And I think a similar thing is at work with readers. The difference is that while teachers are trying to help students to actualize themselves, writers are trying to communicate meaning to their readers, and in order to grasp that meaning, readers have various levels of needs too. So, on this momentous occasion, I am pleased to present the latest from Writing with Andrew Technologies with support from Kaputko International. The Writing with Andrew Hierarchy of Reader Needs. Adapted from the finest of psychological science, the Writing with Andrew Hierarchy of Reader Needs is a universal tool for identifying and fulfilling your reader's needs. Gone are the days where you write your magnum opus and curse the illiterate masses for failing to understand your genius. No more will you have to wonder whether you've actually said what you meant to say. With the Writing with Andrew Hierarchy of Reader Needs, you can ensure that your writing builds from the ground up, communicating meaning at every level to your dedicated readers and leading them to value your work as highly as you do. So don't delay. Get your Writing with Andrew Hierarchy of Reader Needs and transform your void stories into literature to be reckoned with today. Batteries not included. But for real, let's take a look at the hierarchy and see how this all works. Now, right here at the bottom, the most fundamental need a reader has is linguistic significance. Now, this might feel obvious, but if your reader is going to get anything from your work, they need to understand the language you're using. A reader who only understands Spanish is going to have a hard time getting any value out of your work if you only write in Vietnamese. Obviously, linguistic significance is the most fundamental level of understanding a text. It gets deeper than that, though. Sometimes writers do creative or unusual things with language, and I'm not here to say that you should never do that. But I am saying that you might be stopping readers at the most fundamental level if you mess around too much with linguistic significance. If you use a lot of jargon or a lot of rare words, your readers are going to have to reach for a dictionary, or even a less demanding way to spend their free time. I remember when I was still fairly new to writing poetry, but experienced enough to start having ideas about art, I decided to remove anything from my writing that wasn't also present in speech. In practical terms, that meant no more capitalization, no more punctuation, just full commitment to reproducing speech on the page. Now, I felt oh so deep, but week after week, my workshop group kept pointing out serious misunderstandings of my work because they just couldn't tell where one sentence or idea ended and another began. My lack of apostrophes created ambiguities of meaning. My lack of commas created confusions of syntax. I knew what I wanted to say, so I didn't see those issues as clearly. But for readers who did not already know the message, the language and the way I was using it kept readers out rather than welcoming them in. So eventually, I decided that it was probably more important for my readers to know what I was even saying at a base level than for me to be an artiste and pursue pure speech in print. See, it just doesn't matter how brilliant your ideas are if nobody can understand them. No one will ever turn to your poem in a time of emotional distress if it's not in a language they know. Whatever deeper meaning you might want to put in a text, the reader's ability to get it will begin or end with their ability to understand at a fundamental level the words that you've put on the page. But what about Finnegan's Wake? What about that one other author who writes really crazy stuff? Yeah, what about Finnegan's Wake? As a former teacher once said, nobody reads Finnegan's Wake, they read in Finnegan's Wake. It's a curiosity, a stunt, not a richly meaningful text. People poke their nose in to see what's up and then move on because an incomprehensible text is not a satisfying text. And I'm not saying you can't do weird language stuff. You just can't do it and then be upset if people don't fall passionately in love with an essay that refuses any form of linguistic significance. Let's say, though, that I do understand what your words mean and what your sentences are saying. The next layer of fundamental meaning I, as a reader, will need is literal significance. At a basic level, I'm just going to need to know what in the whole wide world is going on. And the void story is the quintessential example of writing that denies readers of this basic need. When I'm reading a Void story, I don't know who I'm reading about or where they are or what they care about or what the story is about or really anything at all. And it's hard to care about a story that I just don't know anything about. We can poke fun at the formulaic nature of the fairy tale, but look at the first sentence of Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Suit. Many, many years ago lived an emperor who thought so much of new clothes that he spent all his money in order to obtain them. His only ambition was to be always well dressed. What do we get? A clearly defined time frame, a clearly identified character, and a straightforward statement about that character's motives that will drive the story forward. The Emperor's New Suit is not a Void story. And again, say what you will about the simplicity of Once Upon a Time, but fairy tales are beloved by countless readers, and they do a great job of meeting the reader's basic need for literal significance right from the start. I've noticed that new writers often overestimate the value of mystery, and many may also misunderstand that mystery and confusion are not the same thing. Void stories resist fairy tale clarity and end up artificially withholding any information from the reader in order to make some kind of dramatic reveal later. But intentionally denying a reader their need for literal significance is going to work against you, not for you. As Philip Lopate puts it, it is more important for the reader to be apprised of the larger facts of the case from the start, and then be led through the suspenseful unraveling of what the writer makes of these facts. The real danger is in leaving the reader with the feeling of being cheated by the writer's withholding of key information. Or, in Robert Frost's words, it is but a trick poem and no poem at all if the best of it was thought of first and saved for the last. Just tell your reader what's going on. I really don't understand what anyone gains from keeping readers in the dark and denying them any solid ground to plant their feet. I've read many a poem where I've said, I can tell that you're worked up about something, but I have no idea what. Is there a reason you won't just tell your reader anything about the context these feelings are coming from? And as an additional point, metaphors are, by definition, not literal. Layers of metaphor can be just as destructive to literal significance as deliberately withholding information can be. I've probably shared this before, but I went to a poetry reading once in college and someone was performing a poem about peanut butter. About halfway through, there was a line that said, "It's not about the peanut butter." When I tell you that I have never rolled my eyes so hard, friends, if your poem isn't about peanut butter, why are we spending so much time talking about peanut butter? And if it's not actually about peanut butter, it could still be about any of the n-1 other things that exist in the universe. And then, if the peanut butter is in fact a metaphor for your relationship with your father, why can't you just tell us that? I can promise you I'll actually get more out of the poem when you give me all of the same pieces that you're working with. Sure, it might be a cliche to say my love is a red, red rose, but it's a far more functional metaphor than it's not about the peanut butter, because it actually gives us a layer of literal significance that the peanut butter poem never does. So build on a foundation of linguistic significance with a healthy dose of literal significance. If your reader doesn't have to spend their mental energy trying to figure out what in the whole wide world is even going on, that is, if they have the basic facts of the case, then they'll have all kinds of energy to spend instead on the more meaningful layers of your work. And speaking of those more meaningful layers of your work, the first one a lot of writers work towards is emotional significance. You want to communicate your feelings, and you want your readers to feel something too. At no point would I say that you shouldn't do that. This is, after all, what makes art so exciting and fulfilling. But it's so much harder to build up real emotional significance without a strong footing in both linguistic and literal significance first. Unfortunately, a lot of writers try to jump right here to have all of the emotions without any of the literal context or comprehensible language. And for the reasons that we've already discussed, those pieces are bound to be less successful than they would be if those writers had just addressed their readers' more basic needs first. But at this point, I also want to point out the very real possibility that you could build up a great foundation in linguistic and literal significance and still end up with a piece that lacks much emotional significance. Just as you can write a void story with perfectly comprehensible sentences, achieving a lower level of significance is no guarantee that your work will achieve a higher one. And I see this all the time too. Right up there with void stories are overly objective poems that just describe stuff without giving us any insight into those images' emotional significance. Essays, too, that only narrate events from the speaker's life without any kind of reflection or commentary can also fall into this category. Of course, we can make this same mistake in real life all the time when we assume that people know how we feel or that they will feel the same way we expect them to in a given situation. But people don't respond emotionally to the same things in the same way, so a little guidance can go a long way. So maybe, instead of just telling us that the sun was high in the sky around midday, you tell us that the sun radiated joy into the summer sky, or that the sun glared down oppressively. Bare facts by themselves don't get us very far. And of course, you could communicate the emotional layer of something more artfully than I just did, but don't forget to keep the literal and linguistic layers intact when you do. For a lot of readers and writers, emotional significance is as high as we need to go. If you can understand a text, comprehend its literal meaning, and derive some emotional response from it, that's a solid measure of success. I can name all kinds of songs, TV shows, paintings, and other forms of art that I really liked and that only took me this far. Give a reader access with linguistic significance, welcome them in with literal significance, and then give them some kind of a payoff with emotional significance, and you can feel good about the artistic work that you've done. More likely than not, a reader who has these three basic needs met is going to feel satisfied with the time they spent with your work. But of course, we're not at the top of the pyramid yet, so we've got a little more climbing to do. And the next stage is intellectual significance. Of all the tiers, this one was the trickiest to name because obviously your intellect is engaged with all the others all the time. But by intellectual significance, I don't mean that your story or poem or essay or whatever else makes sense. I mean that it offers fodder for critical intellectual engagement. And I want to be careful about explaining its placement too. When I put it above emotional significance, I do not mean that it's more important. This isn't a hierarchy of value, but a hierarchy of scale. All readers need linguistic significance in order to read a piece, but relatively few need clear intellectual significance to enjoy one. Just as writers try to jump over the bottom tiers to get right to emotional significance, though, some try to jump straight to intellectual significance. Sometimes, these writers can actually be the most difficult to work with. Isn't that right, Bud?
Sorry. Did you say something? I think I dozed off.
I thought you didn't sleep.
I don't need to sleep. I can, though, if I get bored enough and just want to check out.
How wonderful. Well, now that you're awake, I wanted to ask you again, what is your novella about?
Oh, right. Well, like I said at the beginning, it's a novella with a postmodern twist, but also inspired by the old Hermetic texts and my own experiences. Really, it's about the indomitable nature of genius and the complexities of justice.
And like I said in the beginning, that's not really what your novella is about. That's the intellectual significance you want your novella to have. When I say, what is your story about, I mean, in terms of literal significance, what's going on in your story?
I don't understand. Still, what good's a story that doesn't have rigorous intellectual significance? The characters and plots are all incidental to that. I have profound and important things to say, don't you know?
So, viewers, do you see why writers aiming for intellectual significance as a first priority are harder to work with? They already have big ideas about their work and about literature, and they can have a hard time letting go of their deep thoughts just for long enough to write a basic functioning story. What do I mean? Well, sitting down to write a novel that is a Foucauldian critique of digital spaces gives me the impression that you're really writing an academic paper with a veneer of literary fiction over top of it. Not only that, but a lot of readers aren't going to show up for a Foucauldian critique of digital spaces, but they would show up for a fun story about a gang of friends trapped inside the internet. Give the reader the linguistic, literal, and emotional significance they need first, and only then will they be ready to take on the intellectual significance of your piece. Like, I think it's great if you want to write a poem that's a subversion of postmodern aesthetics, whatever that means, but that's not going to matter to most readers. And it probably won't matter to any readers if it's incomprehensible to begin with. But honestly, between you and me, I don't think you really need to worry about intellectual significance at all because it's generally not yours to claim anyway. It's the critics who will give it to you as they spend generations debating the larger themes of your work in the context of their chosen intellectual traditions. It can be easy to think that you've only arrived as a writer once you have the approval of critics, and that you can only have the approval of critics if you have a lot of intellectual significance in your work. But notice that we're getting pretty high up on this hierarchy of reader needs. If you make impressing critics looking for intellectual significance your first priority, and don't pay enough attention to lower order needs, you'll be playing to a tiny crowd of miserable academics instead of a large and supportive readership of real people. Your first job, in other words, is always to tell a good story or to write a good poem. If you do that, thoughtful readers who need to put on their critic hats and discuss the intellectual significance of a piece will do it. But a story about the indomitable nature of genius, and only about the indomitable nature of genius, is not only not really a story at all, but also probably not interesting enough as a story to attract readers anyway. But if you won't take it from me, take it from former U.S. Poet Laureate Ted Kooser. A lot of this resistance to poetry is to be blamed on poets. Some go out of their way to make their poems difficult, if not downright discouraging. That may be because difficult poems are what they think they're expected to write to advance their careers. They know it's the professional interpreters of poetry, book reviewers, and literary critics who most often establish a poet's reputation, that those interpreters are attracted to poems that offer opportunities to show off their skills at interpretation. A poet who writes poetry that doesn't require explanation, who writes clear and accessible poems, is of little use to critics building their own careers as interpreters. But a clear and accessible poem can be of use to an everyday reader. Or, if I may translate it into the language of this show, a relatively small group of readers make careers of discussing the intellectual significance of other people's writing. That can make writers feel like intellectual significance is the most important thing to put in their writing. But the reality is that the overwhelming majority of readers just need the basics. Write a good, functioning poem and you'll have grateful readers. Meet those basic needs first, and you can build from there. But don't try to build the thing from the roof down.
But I have grand and important things to say about the indomitable nature of genius and the complexities of justice.
I'm sure you do, and again, I'm not saying you shouldn't say them. But I'm just asking, what good is saying something profound and intellectual and philosophical about genius if nobody can understand a lick of it, if nobody has a clue what's going on, and if nobody cares? The higher order tiers in the Writing with Andrew hierarchy of reader needs depend on the lower ones. In just the same way that it's hard to learn calculus when you haven't eaten in 2 days, it's hard to care about the indomitable nature of genius when you're reading your way through an unjustified void. But finally, dear friends, we arrive at the tippy top of our pyramid, a pyramid so great that Maslow wishes he came up with it. And here at the top we find personal significance. There are texts I could read that I didn't understand, texts I understood that I didn't care about, texts I cared about that I didn't study, and texts I've studied that are not deeply meaningful to me in a personal way. And similarly, there are a lot of readers who may really like your work, but who won't count it as something deeply and personally meaningful to them. For a lot of readers and a lot of texts, everyone gets along just fine without personal significance. But every once in a while, a reader finds a text that really matters to them. For the most part, we don't get to know our readers well enough to create texts that are designed to be personally significant to them. Notes and letters to the people closest to us are probably the main exception. But that doesn't mean that we can't set our work up so that it can have the best possible chance of becoming personally significant to someone. And simply put, you do it by building the pyramid from the bottom up. Make your language clear, make your literal meaning clear, make your emotional tone clear, and make your intellectual contribution clear. A reader isn't going to connect with your work in a major way if it withholds any of the other forms of significance from them in some kind of artificial way. As an example, I've shared before that Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, is a piece that has personal significance to me. I won't go into too much depth here because I've already done a whole video reading through it. You can see the details of it there. But the point is that first, As Kingfishers Catch Fire is a poem that has linguistic significance for me. I can tell you what all the words mean and how all the sentences work. It has literal significance. I know what it's about. It has emotional significance. I can tell you what Hopkins felt through the piece, and it makes me feel things too. And it has intellectual significance. I could talk for hours about what this poem reveals about the craft of the poetry, the rigors of writing about faith, the nature of language, and so much more. But it has personal significance too. It's the poem that I think made me a poet. Up until the moment I read that piece, I was flirting with the idea of writing fiction. But then I read that poem and saw that Hopkins was doing something that I'd never seen any other writer do, and I wanted to learn how to do it too. I'm still learning, but I wouldn't have started if not for that piece. It has deeply personal significance for me, and that personal significance is a function of all the other layers of significance that precede it. I also point this piece out as an example because it is a difficult poem. The first time I read it, I wasn't even sure I knew what the poem was saying, much less what it was about. But I sat with it, thought through it, and found myself breaking through the linguistic difficulties and the literal difficulties into an emotional significance that eventually paved the way for the poem to become personally significant to me. But why is this a difficult poem and not a void poem? Because all the pieces are on the page. Yes, Hopkins is doing strange things with language, but he also gives the reader all the tools they need to decipher his unusual syntax in the poem. Yes, Hopkins talks about things in somewhat unusual metaphorical ways, but he builds up patterns and comparisons in the poem that make that literal meaning clear. The key to understanding As Kingfishers Catch Fire is not somewhere in Hopkins' journals or hidden in his brain. The key is in the poem itself. And that's the trick. For newer writers, it can be difficult to see what's not on the page or to anticipate where readers will get tripped up. You know what you mean to say, and it can be hard to differentiate what you meant to say from what you actually said. It's easy then to blame a reader for misunderstanding you, but ultimately the blame lies with you for giving readers enough room to misunderstand. Luckily, though, that's what revision is for, and the Writing with Andrew hierarchy of reader needs can guide you through the process of identifying spots where your writing could be going wrong. If you're using language in unconventional ways, recognize that linguistic significance is the front line of any reader's experience. You don't have to abandon your linguistic creativity, but you do have to give your reader plenty of help to make sense of what you're saying. If you catch yourself writing a void story, don't worry, just recognize the importance of literal significance. If you didn't know what you know about your story as a whole, would you have a good idea of what was going on page 1, or would you feel like you were free falling through a void? Remember, your reader only knows what you tell them, so don't be surprised when they can't read your mind. If you find that you're faithfully conveying the facts of the piece, use the cue of emotional significance to make sure that you're also cueing readers toward the appropriate emotional response. If you're in a rush to jump to the emotions, remember that each of these layers depends on the one below it. Build up that literal context and linguistic clarity first, so that readers can fully embrace the emotional force of your work. And if you're barreling full speed toward an intellectual treatise disguised as poetry or fiction or nonfiction, slow down, take a step back, and make sure that your story works as a story first, or that your poem works as a poem first. Even critics usually like a piece before they study a piece. So mate those primary needs before you try to make your work a pillar in the intellectual community. Readers come to poems for poetry and to novels for story, so don't toss them into a void and leave them alone to grapple with your deep thoughts. If you do, they might get frustrated and decide you're one of those young artists who's high on your own big ideas, rather than a real storyteller or poet. Do those things, and there's no guarantee that your work will become deeply significant to your readers, but you will have done everything you can to welcome them in, show them what's going on, and lead them to feel and think everything you want to communicate to them. Meet all their needs, and you can be sure that at least some of those readers will hold your writing close for a long, long time. So what do you think, Bud? Are you ready to give that novella another try?
No, I think I'm all good. I've kind of moved on from that, and I think I'll just stick to fabricating alchemical constructs for now.
Well, okay, I guess that's your call. But I guess for the rest of us, the Writing with Andrew hierarchy of reader needs is a good reminder that our first responsibility is always to the reader. Keeping them in mind will make all the difference between writing to flatter our egos and show off our brilliance, and writing to connect with our fellow humans and to be, as Ted Kooser says, of service. So please keep on writing, hopefully with a little more care for your reader than you may already have, and we'll see you again in the next one.